Yeah, for today's stream, we're going to be basically focusing on foreign policy perspectives. Now, there's going to be a few areas on this with it. Most people aren't going to be sure of any of this, and they have no idea what I am talking about with this. And because when people think of foreign policy, they either think of either dovish or hawkish, but then this is going to be nothing like this. And it's or like being pro-war against war, and this is going to be nothing of the sort, and it's going to basically be confusing to a lot of people. But it's going to be at least a good educational background into what people need to learn about foreign policy, and kind of give people a little bit of a background, because I have masters in public administration. I can kind of give people an actual lesson in the way things go when it comes to this. I had a 3.83 GPA, so plenty high, and so I do understand exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, when it comes down to it, there's three main schools, and then there's some minor schools as well. We could talk about the minor schools first. First, the basic minor schools with it is there's one of them first with it, which is the Marxist perspective. This basically views things as any type of relations between states is basically viewed as any type of interaction between states is, it would be that there is a max amount of income that one can grab. Basically, they don't view as through voluntary trade that one can actually develop a higher amount of wealth just by specialization as a capitalist would. So because Marxist view is different naturally, so this needs to be understood that when it comes down to the actual perspective, the perspective views things differently, and it basically views things as being it goes into a lot of groups that are basically marginalized, and a lot of these points like this, and it ends up being a lot more confusing into the points of what ends up being considered in the foreign policy perspective than anything else. And it views basically voluntary trade as something such as because they don't view things as voluntary trade as positive, they view it as essentially looting. What they would do is essentially they would view that as a they view that thing as imperialism, and this is voluntary trade, one country trading with one another, and this is something to where they view that as part of their actual platform of actual points. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that they could actually they could view full well with taking over that country militarily, and that would be just to essentially quote unquote liberate them from capitalism. But for that country to essentially voluntarily trade with capitalism would essentially be that country being looted. Yet, if that Marxist nation were to essentially invade them and enter their country and take it over, that would essentially be considered as just, because essentially it deals with a lot of their version of morality over actual over the actual idea of using voluntary trade and dealing with the ideas of you have the right to run your own country and such things as that. They tend to deal with a lot more of these ideas of morality and, well, their version of morality and such as anti-imperialism and uh, against free trade, against actually trading off resources because they don't view actually trade as positive. They view when you trade something you lose. And then when we go to the feminist perspective, now this is one thing where why I've explained before, feminism is Marxist, and this is where it actually derives from. When we look at the foreign policy perspectives, there's a reason why. When we look at the feminist perspective, this is where it comes from, and they view the same thing as this, as they view it as there is no actual way for one to gain the other thing. Now they just view it basically from an actual female-only perspective, and they view it as there is only one way to gain with it. Basically, if one gains, the other loses, and it's the whole idea of this. And it still goes in the idea of a lot of dealing with a lot of subgroups and uh, a lot of the parts like that, and dealing with a lot of these ideas of these morality type of issues, and which really have no bearing in the ideas of such things like the foreign policy perspective. I mean, it's completely irrational because you should be it should be the best the actual most rational decision from your uh, from your actual nation, what actually makes the most decision, not some moral high, not some trying to live some moral high ground that you think is that you think uh, you need to do. That's going to be basically that you're trying to overrule what some other nation is doing, or what you think is, or what's best in the best interest of your people. Because you could state that basically is you could essentially overrule something that would be best interest of your people, such as trading with another nation. But you could say, oh, but trading is inherently wrong because you're looting another country. Well, that's not looting; that's voluntary trade, and that's where these things come from. And the feminist perspective just states that basically is it's it just views it from solely a female-only perspective. That's the only difference between the Marxist perspective and the feminist perspective in foreign policy. And it really is the same idea of any type of variance when we're talking about feminism in other aspects or feminism in the foreign policy perspective. Feminism is just an offshoot of Marxism. Now let's get to the now that we've kind of busted those two out of the way, we can actually get to the actual three main ones. The first one we'll go with is the realist perspective. This basically just views countries as very static, and anytime they change, anytime they have an idea change, they view that as some type of anarchy system, and those anarchy systems need to be restored uh, to the original system that was established. Um, though in other cases that are not, they would never view it as any type of intervention. They would only deal with relations in a normal manner. And that's the whole point with that perspective. That perspective um, is actually quite normal. You see a lot of you see there's quite a few people that will actually state that they believe in this one, uh, but there are certain problems with it because the fact is as leaders change, we need to understand that this is quite flawed in its point, because as leaders change, so do ideas. And you cannot just automatically assume just because an idea changes that that it's automatically anarchy in a country. I mean, you got to think with every time, you can't state that every time there's an election, it's some type of there's some type of massive overthrowing of a country. I mean, you could make the accusation that's going from Barack Obama to Donald Trump was anarchy in the United States, and that you needed to overthrow the country. Or going from, let's say, going from George W. Bush to Barack Obama was anarchy in this country, and we needed to overthrow. Somebody needed to come into the United States and overthrow it. Well, that's complete and utter irrational behavior. That that does not make any sense whatsoever. Uh, because if we did that, it wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. Because ideas change within a country to actually elect new leaders, and there needs to be adjustment for that, and that's what needs to happen. Just because you have this idea of what allyships you have, and where I should say alliances you have with other nations, uh, those need to adjust naturally, and you need to understand that things aren't going to stay the same all the time. Things automatically adjust when you have elections and people's ideas change. They're not going to stay stagnant forever, and that's the problem with the realist perspective. Is it views things with stagnation, and it views things in a way that things are always going to stay the same and exactly the same all the time, and that policy ideas are never going to change. Well, the fact is that policy ideas could be radically different from one leader to the next, and the only way you're going to have a stable leadership is in a dictatorship, and that only happens in tyrannical regimes. I mean, you're looking at that with like such people as like Mao, Stalin, Hitler. Um, we're now seeing that in Xi out in China. Um, we see that with out in North Korea. These are the ones that are basically the ones that we think of when we think of uh, these stable leadership styles. Down in Venezuela, these are these stable leadership styles, and those are the ones that don't change. The ones that do change are the actual legitimate democratic republics that actually have where the people have the right to vote. So and there's basically well over 100 of those. So when we have so many of those, is when we have like over 100 of those, that makes a problem there, and that basically means that most of the world's countries are going to basically be are basically going to be essentially a problem with the realist perspective, and that becomes difficult. I mean, maybe at one time we were going to have a lot more stability with the way leaders would have run things, but now that we have such variance in how we view policy, that it's not the same anymore. I mean, we have policy could be viewed from such a wide stance as it once was. I mean, at one point with it during the earlier 1900s, people were a lot more willing to basically be this like centrist type of leader, so we weren't actually getting any difference from one party to the next. But now we actually have differences, so we actually have choices, and that's where we are at currently, and around the globe. So that's where we see that, and then that's where you're going to see that, and especially during like the when we're looking at the 1980s and such, 1970s and 1980s, there was virtually no choice in a lot of regions around the globe. So that's why you could have been a realist and there was no real difference. But now it doesn't. Now it does not really make much sense. Now let's go to the one that's pretty much the majority of people out there are, and they have been since the turn of the century. This would be the liberal perspective. This fits for both your neoconservatives and your liberals. This is called the liberal perspective. This basically is where you have this idea of creating this world utopian vision. What their idea is they had this idea of intervention. Basically, that this is where intervention comes in. They believe that if they intervene, it does. They can actually create an ideal vision of the world, and nothing bad's going to happen. They don't actually view the ideas of blowback or any type of negative outcomes from this, from their actual military action. They don't actually respect the ideas of sovereignty or country being able to make its own decisions. People like this have been like Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Hillary Clinton, other ones like John Bolton, Benjamin Netanyahu. We see like the Saudis love this. Plenty of people out there. We see John McCain was like this, and it just keeps going on and on. And you could pretty much go for like a mile and find a bunch of people like this. And that's where you find this perspective from. And this perspective basically believes that there that if you basically work hard enough, you can actually essentially remake the world the way you want. No matter what you do with it, there's never going to be any negative consequences, and you can always blame the negative consequences on you can say it's unforeseen outcomes, or you could say you can blame it on something else that's you could always blame it on something else, or you can say, oh, we didn't have enough military forces, or you can always blame it on something else. And these are these type of people that you find. Now, with this perspective, it's basically is create the whole idea of what you want. This is what basically created the whole change in the way our military reacts, the way U.S. military reacts. Its idea is solely that it still believes in the horrible idea that any change in a country is viewed as anarchy, but it also views that you can still go into any nation and reshape it. You can go into any region and recarve up any countries to any shape that you want. Cut the countries up if you want, and actually decide what shapes you want the region to be, and what countries you want them to be named, what all that you want. And you view that there's never going to be any blowback from that, and that's the whole idea with it. It's a very, very naive foreign policy that's very, very different from anything else. And this is something that's you'll find the majority of people, not only in the United States but around the globe, use. because we find that there's a lot of this is basically what we'd call interventionists. These while realists are somewhat into intervention, these people are basically rapidly into intervention. Uh, you'll see like people like on CNN, Fareed Zakaria. You'll see um, General Keane on Fox News is another one. He's another one that's real big in this. George W. Bush, and these ones that are real big in this, and they believe that there's no. They believe all you need is just a few more forces, and you can get it done. No, you can't just start carving up stuff, and then they'll start blaming other. They'll start blaming other countries for their problems, and it's just and that they'll never blame themselves for their stupid decisions. When we see these things, we need to actually look at what actually happened, and that's the whole point. Is what their thing is. They never look inward for their actual problems. So it's just like World War One. World War One was started by the Brits because they were paranoid of the Germans and Austro-Hungarians developing trade with one another. So what they do is the Brits start the war. The U.S. gets involved because the U.S. wanted to be involved with the Brits and the French to essentially be involved with the idea of reshaping the world because Woodrow Wilson was in favor of this idea of this liberal perspective. And in the end, with it, we created the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had the implication of carving up the Middle East, sending Eastern European Jews from Britain down to a new carved up area named Israel. This created tensions because you kicked out all the Palestinians out of that land, and because you carved up the whole Middle East, it created a bunch of conflict, and then when you go up to the actual thing of Germany, because you jailed Hitler for the crime of being in Wilhelm II's army, you essentially create a lot of tension, and you actually created a system where he was basically where he was basically creating a he was basically forced into the only option where he could actually come into power after that, because the options was going into socialism. That created the Nazi Party. Thus, because these liberal perspectives that did it. Now, when we look at the last option, we basically see the last option, which is the identity perspective. This is the only realistic perspective we have. Now, this is only viewed by a small number of people because it's actually legitimate. We see people like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey actually look at this. Those are two examples. There's a few others as well. You see other people that discuss it, such as his dad, Ron Paul, and Daniel McAdams, and other people like the Mises Institute talk about this as well. People at the Cato Institute, people at the Mercatus Institute, at George Mason University talk about this. But this is basically the way things go, and this is basically what ends up happening is they end up talking about this, and it's very important that it's based on just ideas, and they realize that ideas control the world. And that's a major point to be made. And when we realize that ideas control the world, that's the whole point. And it's important to realize this. And when we realize that ideas control the world, it's something that is highly important. And um, when we realize that is it's a major factor that's needs to be understood, and these ideas and once these ideas are and these ideas are just basically where the country world needs to go, because when you talk about looking at ideas instead, it basically realizes that people are going to be going with voluntary trade from country to country, and that's the whole point. And you're not going to be viewing these as looting a country because it's voluntary trade, and we're not going to be talking about, you don't deal with like the irrational points of Marxist perspective or feminist perspective, because like those with it, and then when it comes down to dealing with from nation to nation, you're going to view these things as they're just ideas. And when it comes, if you view something coming up that's you want to actually impact in the country, you don't impact it by bombs and soldiers on the ground. You can impact it by ideas. If you want another country to become capitalist, do leadership by example, and you can also what it calls to start spreading out capitalist materials with it out to those areas, and just do laissez-faire capitalism. Don't do this crony capitalism. Trust me, you don't need to be spreading that disease around. And that's how you end up actually developing these things, and you want these relations between country to country. You don't need the actual ideas, and you don't need actually trying to take over these nations. If you want to give freedom with it, that's how you do it. You don't need to intervene between these nations. Like what's happening in Venezuela is one example with it. They're trying to state that, oh, we can force, but and oh, they're not willing to take aid. Well, the fact is they're the U.S. is not willing to let them inspect the trucks, and that's a big issue, because the fact is we said that we were giving the Iraqis humanitarian aid, and we were giving the Libyans humanitarian aid, and we were giving the Syrians humanitarian aid. Well, it turned out we were giving the Iraqis weapons, we were giving the Libyans weapons, we were giving the Syrians weapons every single time. And this shows that we can't be trusted when it comes down to this with what we're saying. And especially when we have, in two of those three cases, John Bolton was at the helm. And who's at the helm right now? John Bolton. And we also saw in the case in the in Central America when we were claiming that we were just giving aid, and that was and who was at the helm with that? Elliot Abrams. That's who's the envoy. I mean, when we're talking about this, this is one of the cases why we're looking at that. That's what needs to be understood. Now, if you like this, I know this is going to be a little bit brief with it, but if you like this live stream, like it, subscribe, click the notification bell, and I will see you guys later for my daily podcast. And this one's going to be on the role of the executive for today. Bye for right now.